Hi, I'm Laura Nelkin. I'm a knitwear designer. I live in upstate New York in the Finger Lakes region, and this video tutorial introduces you to the third and final kit for 2023's N Club Sativum set. I borrowed the word sativum for Latin. It means cultivated. And I think it perfectly describes the kind of like rich, harvesty, earthy vibes of this design. Sativum set has two components to it. One component is a long cowl that you can wear either wrapped double around your neck or singly. And then the other part of Sativum set is this really fun hat that I'm wearing. The cowl has what I call a wheat stitch on it that has beaded sections and not beaded sections. And then the hat does not have any beads on it as all. I'll go into detail about the similarities and differences of these two patterns as we jump into this video. I'm very excited for the yarn that I used in Sativum set. That yarn is from Little Fox Yarn. I worked with two different bases of hers. One of them, the DK yarn, has just like this lovely crisp definition to it. And then Willow, the sport weight yarn, has this kind of lovely halo with these hemp fibers in it. And I think you're going to find that they lend themselves to create a fabric that just like screams autumn, like autumn. I could have named it that, but I'm sure there's already 100 patterns named autumn out there. So one thing I want to tell you about this tutorial is I'll be going over all of the bits that I think you'll need to know to have success knitting the patterns, but there are many things in the pattern that I already have separate videos for. Ones I can think of off the top of my head are a German twisted cast on, stringing on beads, my little trick for working brioche in the round, and the Icelandic bind off. So all of those videos I will link to below this video, along with a timestamp so you can find things in the video if you're like wondering how to do a stitch or how to work with the beads. You don't have to watch from the start to get to those points in the video. It is also very important for me to tell you that this is a companion video to a pattern, so you will need the pattern to follow along. And if you are in 2023's N Club, you should have the download code in your kit to get that pattern. Definitely email me if it doesn't work. And if you are watching this a year later, so in fall of 2024, and you're knitting Sativum set, you will need to have the pattern to follow along with this to have success. So the first thing that I want to do is go over everything that's in your kit. Okay, let's talk about the materials that you need for knitting Sativum. I'll be really focusing on what is in your kit for 2023 N Club members. And if you are wanting to knit this pattern with another yarn, you can just kind of follow the guidelines for the two yarns that I used. I think you'll find that this pattern will lend itself really well to a variety of yarns. So underneath the camera here, I have the two yarns that I used for Sativum set. True Wash DK is 100% GOT certified merino wool, and it has about 264 yards to 115 grams. It is a DK weight yarn. It's got this lovely tight twist on it, and Amy at Little Fox dyed it in this absolutely gorgeous color that we decided to call spicy maple, and that's really what it is. It's kind of like a hot maple. Like if somebody put some cayenne pepper into your maple syrup, I think it would be this color exactly. So I took the True Wash DK and I paired it with Amy's Willow. And Willow is a yarn that I first got 2 or 3 years ago. I got a skein of Willow, and it's a 70% fine organic merino blended with 30% hemp. This is a sport weight yarn, so it's got about 328 yards to 100 grams. And this is the yarn that you'll be stringing your beads onto because it's a bit finer and your beads will fit on it. You can see that hemp gives this fiber, just like this lovely kind of chunky, kind of tweedy quality to it, but it's still really, really soft against the skin. And I think you're gonna really love working with both of these bases. When I met Amy and I was looking at her bases, I was like, is it possible to put these two together? Because the contrast of the texture of the yarns just kind of adds to the stitches beautifully, instead of using two yarns that are the same base where there isn't contrast between the two of them. So I've given you two colors that contrast but really like coordinate beautifully together in that fall vibe. And then the next thing in your kit is beads. And I used 3 different colors of beads in your kit. These beads are all permafrost Toho beads, and you will see that if you want, you can keep your beads separate or you can mix them all together. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the beading section. But basically, the darkest beads are A, the middle color bead is B, and the lightest color yellow bead is C. So that will help you with your stringing. Your kit also has a dental floss threader, and that dental floss threader is there as a large eye beading needle. If you have never used one of these before, I do have a separate video teaching you how to string beads on your yarn. And then finally in your kit is the thing I might be the most excited about this year. And this is a handmade leather butler dish with a beading spout on one side. And these are all handmade by my friend Renee at Uncle Joe's Saddlery. And you can use it, you can kind of pour your beads into it. And then as you need beads, or if it's time to put them back into your bag, you can just use that little pour spout to pour them out. And it's also a great dish for picking up your beads. I have one next to my knitting chair right now that has all of my like end stoppers and stitch saver pieces in it and my stitch markers, and it's really lovely. It was a big ask to ask Renee to make these dishes for us. She had to start in June because I think she could only make like 20 or 30 at a time because they were all formed by hand, which is pretty special. And you know, I love working with local artisans. We had a lot of back and forth for design on this dish. It was really fun for me to think about what would make a really unique piece that would be a great memory of our year together, and something that was really geared as a tool towards something that we would want as knitters. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Otherwise, in your kit, whoops, I just got beads everywhere, so maybe don't pour as quickly as I just did. Other things that are in your kit are some tea and some ginger candies, just to have a little sweet treat and a cup of tea while you are working on your Sativum set. Otherwise, for materials, what you're going to need are needles and then an optional crochet hook if you decide that you want that for the wheat stitch. And if we just look at the pattern together, you'll see that the needle sizes are a little bit different for the hat and the cowl. The gauge on the cowl is a little bit looser and the gauge on the hat is a little bit tighter, which makes sense so that the hat fits onto your head and then the cowl has a little bit of looseness. So what you're going to do is needle B, which is the smaller needle size, is the size you're going to get gauge with. And then needle A is 2 sizes larger from what you get gauge with. And then for the hat, needle C is the smaller, 2 sizes smaller than what you're using to get gauge, and needle D is the needle you're getting gauge with. And I'll talk about that again when we look at gauge together. If you are working with the same yarn, oh, I was going to talk about that in gauge, so I'm not, it's so easy for me to like zhuzh right into the next thing. So let's jump ahead and talk about gauge together in a really organized manner. Okay, friends, let's talk about gauge. I know that you're probably thinking this is just a cowl and just a hat, and I don't need to to do gauge, and you're right, you don't have to do gauge, but if you don't want to run out of yarn and you want to ensure that your stitches aren't totally loosey-goosey, or on the other hand aren't totally tight, you might want to do gauge. And what I've done for this pattern is used the main color, which is the True Wash DK, and the US size 5 needle, which is either needle B or it's needle B for the cowl and needle D for the hat. So if you use that US size 5 to start with, and you work a garter stitch swatch flat, since we're all using the same yarn, if you get a gauge of 19 stitches and 40 rows over 4 inches, then you are good to go. You do not need to block that swatch. If you are working with another yarn and you want to make sure that you get gauge, then I do suggest casting on for the pattern stitch with the needle that is used for the pattern stitch in either the cowl or the hat. And I have given you that direction on the pattern. So for the cowl, it's going to end up being 16 stitches and 28 rounds equals 4 inches in pattern stitch on needle A. And for the hat, it is 18 stitches by 30 rounds equals 4 inches in pattern stitch on needle D. So you can see that I'm giving you all the information that you really need if you're working with another yarn to make sure that you get gauge. But one of the fun things about a club, when I'm choosing your yarn for you and kind of curating the experience, we can kind of skip blocking our gauge, all use the same yarn. If you know that you knit loose, just cast on with needle B down one size, cast on with the US size 4 to make your stitches a little bit tighter. And if you know that you knit tight, like you knit tighter than I do, but now that we're into the third kit of the club, you might have an idea of where you land with needles compared to my patterns, then cast on with a needle size bigger. So that would be a US size 6. And then that means when you're using the bigger needle for the cowl, that bigger needle would end up being an 8 if you got gauge with the 6, right? And if you got gauge with the 6 here, then your needle C would end up being a 4. If that gets confusing, of course, ask questions in the Ravelry group. I'll set up a thread for this. You can also ask them below this video, or you can ask them over in our private Facebook group. So you do have places to ask questions if you get confused as you are casting on. If you skip your gauge, just don't tell me and I won't send the knitting police after you, okay? Ha ha ha. The other thing that the other thing that can happen if you don't do gauge is you might not have enough yarn in the skeins to work the cowl and the hat. And let's kind of talk about the measurements on those next. Okay, construction-wise, I have gone a little bit simpler with this kit because Beauteous was definitely going in every single direction, and I love to have a balanced year with you all and not kind of like end the year by rocking your world. So the cowl is knit in the round from the bottom up. If I pull it over and just kind of show it to you right here, you're casting on at this bottom edge right now, and you're working in the round. I believe you have 168 stitches on your needles, and you are working up in the round and then binding off at the top. So it doesn't really get any simpler for construction than that. The measurements for the cowl are about 7.5 inches high and 44 inches around. The hat is cast on at the brim with a smaller needle, and the brioche is knit up, and then you are working the wheat stitch up to the crown. There is one size for the hat because it is a 14 stitch repeat. So if I took away those 14 stitches, it made a hat that was like puny. And if I added 14 stitches, it was like the hat was way too big. So what I did is I tried to cast on in a way with the cast on and the brioche that the brim is really, really stretchy and it's going to fit a variety of sizes of hats. If you're like, my noggin is really big and I'm worried about it not fitting, then you could kind of zhuzh up a needle size. So instead of using a size 3 and a size 5, use a 4 and 6 or one size bigger than you get gauge with. And that will make the hat just a little bit looser and give you a little bit more flexibility here. But I think the hat stretches to about a 23-inch circumference head. You always want a hat to be smaller and stretch so that it stays on your head. Have any of you ever worn a hat where it slowly comes down over your eyes as you're doing something outside in the winter? We do not want that. So I feel pretty good about this one size of hat, but there are ways by changing your needle size that you can kind of tighten it up a little bit or loosen it up if you think you need to. It is a really fun hat to knit. I love the crown, and you'll hear me say that again later in this video. So now let's just kind of focus on the cowl. I'm going to teach you the stitches that I use. We're going to talk about brioche. For those of you who haven't knit a lot of brioche, kind of do a brioche primer and everything that I think you'll need to know to have success with the cowl. And then we'll do the same thing with the hat. Okay, let's look at the cowl under the camera, and I'll kind of point out what's happening with each step, and then we'll jump in with some brioche, okay? If you look down here at the bottom, you are casting on with the German twisted cast on and the main color. And then you are starting to work the brioche, and the first rounds are worked with the main color as the knit stitch in the brioche column. And then the last 3 rounds are worked with the contrast color, the willow, in the brioche column. And what that does is it kind of creates a gradient going up. So then we're starting with garter stitch here with the main color, but we end up in garter stitch here with the willow. And I think it's part of why, though this is a simple pattern, there's this really nice kind of flow of the colors from one step to the next that is kind of unexpected for your eye as it's following the stitches along. And then there is 2 rows that are done in garter stitch in the main color, and then you're jumping into the wheat stitch. And you can see that I have wheat stitches that don't have beads that are done in the main color, and then I have wheat stitches that are done with beads that are done in the contrast color. The other thing that I'll be showing you how to do in a few minutes is how to do this SKPTBL, or what Max likes to call the skip table stitch. So I'll be showing you how to do the wheat stitch and this stitch, which just makes a really lovely texture in the center of the cowl. But the first thing we should do is jump in and play with brioche. And I'm going to tell you that the hardest part of this first section of Sativum is using the correct yarn and paying attention to the pattern where it says MC or CC. If it helps you, you can kind of use a highlighter to highlight MC or CC to kind of separate them from each other to make it easier so that you're working with the right yarn. All right, let's do the brioche together. You're going to notice on my needles that I'm working with a yarn that is nowhere near the same color that Amy dyed for us. And that is because those colors don't contrast well enough with my hands, so they just don't show up well enough for a tutorial. And I am going to be showing you how to do basic brioche, just in case you haven't done this before. And when you start with brioche, the first thing you do is work a setup round with your main color and then a setup round with your contrast color. And what I absolutely love about doing brioche in the round is the 2 sets of rounds are always the same. So you don't have to worry about things changing from row to row like you would if you were working flat. So I'm just going to knit in 2 stitches to give myself a little base. And now I'm working setup round 1 with the MC. So I'm going to knit 1 stitch, and then I'm going to bring my yarn to the front of my work, and I'm going to slip the next stitch while I bring my yarn to the back of my work. And you can see I just kind of came over that stitch. It's like I'm making a yarn over as I slip this stitch. And let's do that a few more times so that you really see that. I'm knitting a stitch, bringing my yarn to the front, and bringing it over. These stitches right here count as one stitch now in brioche. So that's a stitch and that's a stitch. And now I'm going to knit one, and now I'm going to slip one, bring it over. You're going to see as I start to do it a little bit more quickly that it's a really kind of just loose flow as I am working those stitches. And now I'm just going to knit the last two stitches so I have a little edge. Since I'm working flat and not in the round, I'm just going to slide these stitches to the other end of my needle, and I am ready with my very lively contrast color. And again, I'm just going to knit these first two stitches. Since I'm working flat, you are not going to be doing that on your pattern since you're in the round. And now I'm going to be working a slip one yarn over and then a brioche purl. So the first thing I'm going to do is bring my yarn to the front of my work, do that slip one yarn over. Now I'm going to make sure that I have my yarn to the front of my work, and I am going to work that yarn over from the previous row together with the stitch. And now I'm going to leave this yarn to the front of my work. I am going to slip that next stitch, wrap the yarn over it, making a yarn over that counts as one stitch. And now I am going to do a brioche purl where I am working together those two stitches together. And now I'm going to do a slip one yarn over, bringing my yarn to the front because I'm on a brioche purl round, and working those together. Just like that. Just like that. I love brioche. I find that brioche really ends up with a rhythm when you get into it, particularly when you're working in the round. So now, since I'm working in the flat and you all are working in the round, I'm going to simulate working in the round by just bringing my main color kind of across the back of my work. One of the reasons I'm working on double pointed needles is so I can slide things around. And now I am continuing on with round one of the pattern, which says with main color BRK, which is brioche knit, and then slip one yarn over and repeat that across. Again, I'm just working those first two stitches. You are not doing that. And now a brioche knit has me working these two stitches together. And now you'll see I get this really clear knit column right there. Once you work those first two rounds to set up, your brioche is really established and it's easy to see. So now I'm going to bring my work to the front of my work. I'm working a slip one yarn over and then leaving it to the back because my next stitch is a brioche knit. And now slip one yarn over, brioche knit, slip one yarn over, brioche knit, slip one yarn over, brioche knit, and then let me just get myself some more working yarn so I'm not yanking. Slip one yarn over, brioche knit, slip one yarn over. Now, if you're working in the round, I have a separate video for this. Whenever you get to the last stitch of your round, you always want to leave your yarn to the front of your work. And that's how you won't end up with any kind of transitional line when you're doing your brioche. And I'll give you a second video for that to watch that a little further. Again, I am just knitting those last two stitches. And then since I'm simulating working in the round, I'm bringing my yarn back across, and I'm going to be working round two with you, which is with the contrast color. I'm going to slip one yarn over and then brioche purl. So we've already done this together. I just kind of really want you to see how this is building as I do it. So I'm going to slip one yarn over, brioche purl. Now, what happens with brioche, if I kind of look at these stitches, you can see that I alternate from a stitch that doesn't have the contrasting color to a stitch that does. So if there's no contrasting color and I'm working with a contrasting color, I am going to slip one yarn over. And if there is a contrasting color there, I'm going to brioche purl. And I'll just continue like that across. if we go to look at how this is kind of starting to build, you can really see those brioche stitches there. You can see the knit column and you can see the brioche purl column. So with this pattern, if I just kind of go to grab it again and show it to you, you can see that we're not syncopating the knits and the purls in the brioche. The knit column is going all the way up and the purl column is going up. The only thing that's changing is after round 2, you're switching so that you're working with the contrast color in the knit column and the main color in the purl column. So you'll see that start to change. Those 2 rows, which I guess are rounds 3 and 4, might kind of like throw you for a loop for a second since you're switching yarns, but I think you'll get into it very quickly as you see it start to build on your needles. So now that I've showed you the brioche and reminded you to pay attention to whether you're using main color or contrast color, the next thing to do is show you how to work that skip table, the SKPTBL. Okay, let's pretend that I have a cowl on my needles and I'm on round 7 and I am ready to do the SKPTBL. I have a little flat swatch here down on my needles. The first thing that you're going to do is knit 2 at the beginning of round 7. And now you're at a SKPTBL and you will get very comfortable doing these very quickly because there are columns of them throughout the entire cowl. The first thing I'm going to do is slip the first stitch knitwise, and now I'm going to knit the next stitch, and then I'm going to take this stitch and slip it over, but I am not going to let it off the needle. Then I am going to knit into the back loop of that stitch. So what I have done with that stitch is created this kind of like faux cable decorative column, but I'm not increasing or decreasing stitches. I'm just manipulating their positions. So if I was to show that to you one more time, because a picture is worth 1,000 words, I'm just going to back up on my needles and I am ready to go again. I'm going to slip the first stitch knitwise. I'm going to knit the next stitch. I'm going to pass that slip stitch over, but not drop it off the left-hand needle. And now I'm going to knit into that stitch. And there you go. I've done the SKPTBL or skip table. So now that you have done that, the next thing to do is show you how to work the wheat stitch and beaded wheat stitches. So let's do that next. Okay, for those of you that did the cowl mystery knit along with me, this stitch is going to look a lot like the feather stitch because it is, but I called it the wheat stitch because that just went better with Sativum than feather stitch, which went better with owls. So the wheat stitch is the feather stitch. I'm going to go over how to work it with a knitting needle and with a crochet hook, because some of you might find that working it with a crochet hook is easier. The trick to this stitch is to leave your loops long and loose so that you can pass them over and they make this nice little floofy thing. I think you'll find with this yarn that it takes to the feather stitch really well, and also with the garter stitch on each side of it, it really helps the feather stitch pop a little bit because your colors are changing, and that garter stitch is a really nice texture behind it. So first I'll show you how to do it without beads, and then I will show you how to do it with beads. So let's jump right into that. When you go to work the feather, see, even I just called it the feather stitch, the wheat stitch, you're going to count down 7 rows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I'm going to come down 7 rows, and I am going to grab my yarn, wrapping the yarn so that the left leg of the new stitch is to the front of the needle and the right leg is to the back. And you're going to make that nice and long and loose. And now I'm going to come down and I am going to do that 5 more times. Make sure they're really loose as you go to wrap it and you're not pulling that yarn back up. So you've got a total of 6 wraps right there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And now you're going to knit the next stitch. So you have a total of 7 stitches right there. And now you're going to start with the first loop that you made and lift that all the way up and over all of those other stitches. And then you're going to go to the next loop, and then you're going to go to the next loop, and the next loop, and the next loop, and the last loop right there. So what you're left with is that final knit stitch, and it makes this beautiful little pod of wheat or sheaf of wheat right there. And you can see how it's really popping against the garter stitch background. You might notice that you feel like you have a little bit of a big hole right here on this side. You can kind of help that by making sure this stitch right here isn't too loose by kind of like pulling it up into that kind of bottom first loop. I find that when you go to block, if there is a little hole there, that it just kind of disappears in the fabric, so don't worry about it too much. Now I want to show you how to do that exact same stitch with a crochet hook, should you find that to be easier, because some knitters really enjoy doing this with a crochet hook instead of with a knitting needle. So I'm just going to rip this back out for a second and then I'll show you how to do that. The rule is the same here, that you want to do this loosely, and the maneuvers are the same. You're making 6 loops total. You're counting down 7 rows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then with the crochet hook, I'm going to go in and grab the working yarn, making a nice long loop, and then putting that loop onto the needle so that that leading leg is on the left side of the stitch. And that's a pretty important maneuver. You might find that not putting too much tension on your yarn at this point is really helpful. And now I'm going to continue like this with the crochet hook, pulling up loops, making sure that left leg is to the front. If you don't have the left leg to the front of the needle, then when you go to pass those stitches over, you end up with kind of this like twist at the bottom of the wheat, and it doesn't end up looking as floofy. So that's kind of the reason why you want to have that left leg to the front right there. You can tell that I do this more comfortably with a knitting needle than a crochet hook, but I get why people really like to do it with a crochet hook, so I thought it was important to show it. And now we're going to come around with that last one, and then finally a knit stitch. And now this maneuver is the same, where I'm going and picking up the stitches one by one, starting with the last one and going over until I get my lovely little piece of wheat right there. And you can see how it's nice and floofy and pretty. So that is the wheat stitch without beads. The next thing that we're going to do is the wheat stitch with beads, and I'm going to do that with my knitting needle, but if you like using a crochet hook, you can certainly do this with a crochet hook as well. Okay, time for the beaded wheat stitch. I am cheating a little bit right here because I've just brought my contrast color over. Normally, whenever you're doing the beaded wheat stitch, this stitch right here would be the main color because you will have already worked 2 rounds with the main color. But I just want to show you the action, which is exactly the same whether you're in a main color or contrast color row. So the first thing I'm going to do is count down 7 rows, just like before. I'm going to go into that stitch, and when I go to grab my yarn to make my big loop, I'm going to take 4 beads that I have strung onto my yarn, and I do have a separate video for stringing on beads. Now with these beads, you can go ahead and string them in order as they are written in the pattern, or you can go ahead and just string them on randomly. I thought it would be fun to kind of show you my design swatch as I was figuring out this stitch. And you can see when I started this, I used all solid color beads, and that just kind of looked like a hot mess to me, and I didn't like it. And then this version, I tried to do this like 3, 2, 1 thing. And it was just going to make the pattern too heavy, and it was like a little too bulky. So I ended up going with this kind of 2 beads of the dark, 2 beads of the medium, and 1 bead of the light. So if you are stringing on beads, make sure that your A bead is the darkest bead, your B bead is the middle bead, and your C bead is the lightest bead, just like I have written in the pattern. I just thought it would be good to show that to you so you understood it. But I'm going to do it with this kind of brighter yarn down here because I just think it's going to be easier for you to see. So I'm going to back up and just start that thing. I'm going to go into that 7th hole right there. I'm going to go get my yarn. I've slid up 4 beads so that when I go to pull this yarn loop through, I am popping the 4 beads through with it. That you saw how my finger was popping them through from the back. Then I'm pulling it up really long, and I'm going to split these beads right here so that 2 beads are on the left leg and 2 beads are on the right leg. Don't worry too much about that. If it gets a little bit awkward, you'll be able to manipulate them as necessary, but you kind of want to try to have them there as much as possible. Now the next row that I am going to go into, I am going to grab a loop, but I'm not going to have any beads on it. So I'm going to do 1 loop without beads. And now this next loop, I'm going to go in and I'm going to slide up 4 beads. And you can see I'm getting those beads to kind of the far side of the loop. So when I loop over the needle, I'm pulling the yarn through, and then I am popping those. Let's see if that is going. Those beads just went too poppy on me. So that was a good example of the beads getting pushed up on. So let's kind of back up and do that correctly. Okay, so I'm pulling up and making sure those loops are loose. I'm going into the next stitch that I want to have a loop on. I'm grabbing my yarn and popping all 4 of those beads through. And now, as I pull up that loop, you can see I'm splitting my beads as I pull it up, so those beads are ready to go. Now the next loop, I'm going to work without any beads and pull it up just like this. And now this last loop that I'm going to work, I'm going to go in, I'm going to just slide up 2 beads on this one and bring that loop up with the 2 beads. The last one is no beads, and then I'm going to knit a stitch. So now that looks kind of like a hot mess, and you're like, what has Laura gotten me into? What you're going to do, and I'm just going to slide these beads down a little bit so they're out of the way, is start to slip these over. Remember, you kind of want to have your beads already separated to the left and right leg before you go to do that, and then they will lay beautifully. And I'm so excited for y'all to see this once I have done this stitch. So I'm just lifting over 1 loop at a time. Every other loop has beads on it. There we go. And there is my last stitch. And now I have a beaded wheat stitch right there with beads on every other loop. It will be awkward the first few times you do it while you're trying to get those beads to slide up and come through the hole. I promise that it gets easier. If you want, you can just cast on a little swatch and play with it instead of having all of those beads pre-strung on your yarn. You are stringing on all your beads at once that you need for the pattern so that you don't have to worry about it again. happy to ask you any questions. I did not give you enough beads in the kit to also put beads on the hat. The hat was an afterthought because there was enough yarn left in the kit that I was like, oh, I want to give them a hat as well. And I decided we didn't really need beads on like a basic fall hat. But if you have beads in stash and you decide that you want to put beads on the hat, you could do that. You just want to make sure that they're on the contrast color and not on the main color. So let me know if you have any questions about this. I will tell you that my testers did it without any video at all. They were able to follow the words in the pattern, but I think a video for this kind of technique, just kind of seeing what my hands are doing and how they're manipulating those beads as I bring them up there, is really, really helpful. So that is basically everything that I have to teach you for the cowl. You're going to follow the pattern as written. You'll end up binding off with an Icelandic bind off. There's a video tutorial link for that below. And then you will weave in your ends and block it. One of the things I love about this cowl is there are not a lot of ends to weave in versus like Beauteous, which had a few ends to weave in, right? So next thing, let's quickly talk about the hat and then you are good to go. So as I get into this section of the video, I am recognizing that I've already told you everything about the hat, which is kind of silly of me, but I'm obviously love it and I'm very excited about it. And it's an afterthought to the pattern. I was actually on the cruise working on this design in my room and I realized I had enough yarn, and my roommate Andrea and I decided there definitely needed to be a hat too. And I've been wearing it whenever I can get away with it, that I know nobody from the N Club is going to see me, and there's no one in the tiny town of Trumansburg that is in the N Club, so I am safe on that one. So for the hat, the biggest things are you are not working with beads, and the main color and the contrast color are switched. And that is because I wasn't confident that there was enough of the main color that you would have enough to knit the whole hat, and there was a bunch of the contrast color left. After doing all of my swatching and everything with this pattern, I have about this much of the contrast color left, which is a lot. And I have about like 10-15% left of the main color, which just didn't, after doing all of my like design swatching and gauge swatching, it just didn't feel like enough for me to feel safe on that. So other things I could think of for the crown that I want to tell you is that I love the crown of this hat so much. And you can just see how like tidy it is, and it just kind of like comes in towards the center. It's a very, very satisfying crown to knit. It was really fun to do the math to get those wheat stitches to kind of like come up and do their decreases and end up in that tidy little round at the top. So I think you're going to have a really good time knitting the hat. I will tell you, it doesn't matter if you want to knit the hat first as like practice for the cowl and then knit the cowl so that you're comfortable with the wheat stitch and you're comfortable with brioche. That is absolutely fine. You can cast on the hat first and do the cowl next, or you can do it the other way around. There's no reason like yarn wise to do one over the other. And in fact, I would say if you're new to the wheat stitch and you are new to brioche, it might really make sense to do this hat first. And I should tell you, if you are a brioche knot lover, for either of these patterns, for this hat, you could do some garter stitch, like some, or sorry, not garter stitch. You could do some like syncopated ribbing if you wanted to, if you don't like garter stitch, if you don't like brioche, can't even find my words. And for the cowl, you could just do more garter stitch rounds if you don't want to do the brioche. So you have ways around things to make these designs your own. And you know that I love to see you get creative with my patterns. I would never be upset if you decided to change something to make it your own. If anything, I find that just so exciting. So I think I've taught you everything you need to know, but if there is anything that I have missed, please do ask questions. I'm happy to help you. I'll give you links to everything below, like Amy at Little Fox Yarns, those tutorials I talked about, our Facebook group, our Ravelry group. ask questions. Let's knit together. I cannot wait to see these flying off your needles. And thank you so much for being part of 2023's N Club. I will tell you that below this video, if it is the fall of 2023 when you are watching this, there is a link to sign up for 2024's N Club, and I hope that you will join me for another exciting year of design and techniques. I've had a really fun time kind of pushing the limit on things this year, and I hope you've enjoyed doing that with me. I really, really appreciate your support. Happy knitting.